All right. One of these days, I'll have a film team as well, and everybody does it properly. So, this is just the best we can do right now. All right. One more minute. See if anybody joins us live. And we'll go. I would love the camera not to be as broad. I don't know why it does that on YouTube and not on my other platforms. But we are good. All right. Welcome to the Real Humans, Great Souls podcast. And today's super hot topic of the spectrum of sexuality. Why did I pick that spectrum? Well, we all are here because of sexuality and such a thing as sexual reproduction. But in addition to that, I've been fascinated by this topic ever since my childhood years. And maybe because it was such a mystery to us, I'll talk about that later, I have continued to be fascinated by the topic. And I believe it has, or I know, I don't like the word believe. I know it has great influence and impact upon our lives, our culture, our authenticity, our behavior in general, our interaction with each other, even war and peace. Now that's really broad, but it's true. Wars have been started, after all, over some conflict with a love relationship or lack thereof. All right, so we go over a couple of main topics, and I'm trying to cover a lot here in this hour, starting with reproduction in animals and mammals, going to humans, why we need sexuality in quotation marks, what is desire, what is culture, what happened in old cultures preceding the patriarchal empirical structures and certain religious structures. And then how did religion operate and change all that? And then I go a little bit into my life and my life experience, just a few pointers as to how I learned. And then to the human biology and the great spectrum of therein. And last but not least, of course, what makes human sexuality so special, so different from animal sexuality? What is all that, and how does all that fit into the current transition into a new era where we do almost everything a little different or a lot differently? All right, so back to the beginning. And that is reproduction. Life exists because of reproduction. Now, what we call sexuality seems to be only when reproduction involves copulation, we call that, or intercourse, or the physical combination of the male and female organs to produce offspring, to do reproduction. So then we suddenly call it sexuality. Now, we know that all mammals, including humans, require that copulation in order to reproduce, except for some modern technologies. But there are actually quite a few creatures that have what is indeed called asexual reproduction, where the female deposits eggs or ovum or a mass of multiple such eggs, and male deposits what is semen, and the copulation, if you will, or the interjection, the germination of the offspring happens externally from the body of the female. Of course, we have that also in birds and lizards, but I just learned that some lizards actually do asexual reproduction. But most birds still have the copulation act, and then the eggs are fertilized, and then they are deposited outside the womb, if you will, to grow. So mammals, however, all require the copulation act to perpetuate the species. So why then we really want to ask, is it such a taboo topic when we all are here because there has been copulation, there has been sexuality between our parents? So that being put out there as a biological requirement for reproduction. And of course, we could talk about all the different forms of reproduction and raising the young and how that varies in different species, and how the newborn is dependent more or less on being close to the mother, the female, for experiencing growth, right? Then, of course, we get to lactation and the mammals that have lactation, and therefore there's greater dependency. Now we've taken even that away with modern technology, again in quotation marks. I don't know whether formula falls under technology. And have managed to raise even humans without human milk. What, of course, the fallout is from that, or the side effects or the disadvantages to the next generation that grows up without that mammalian feature, namely benefiting from the lactating mother and absorbing those nutrients, is not, there's not enough time to talk about that within this framework. But yes, so there is this prolonged sexuality moving into that bondage between mother and child, to then grow into an independent child and still dependent on parentage to grow into a full human being. And in some larger mammals, there is also that time of raising. So it's not just the sexual act required for reproduction, but more is required for reproduction. Next, then, who has desire? Who has more than just the instinct to reproduce, the mating time, which happens in many animals at a certain time in the year, and or twice in the year, and or whichever the cycles are, depending on the size of the animal, right? So mating time in the human species is not the only thing, if even at all, in existence. that drives us to have sexuality. So then why do we have this need for sexuality when we don't really need to produce 50 offspring so that to survive or in one go, as is the case, of course, in many animals. And yet, every woman has in our womb, I'm not quite sure, but lots of eggs that we don't use. And of course, every man has hundreds of thousands or millions of sperm that are superfluous, if you will. And yet, it seems to be designed in nature that way, or it seems to be evolved, designed, whichever you would like that there's always lots more seed than will actually sprout into the next generation of life. And that is the same with outside my window is a big chestnut tree, with hundreds of chestnuts falling down, but I don't see lots of chestnut trees growing up under it, right? In fact, none. So there's so much in this reproduction happening that seems to not require much copulation to produce plenty of offspring to continue the species. But we humans seem to be the only ones who have a desire to control or carry out our desire much more at will than any other species. Now, I understand that bonobos, a certain monkey, love to have lots and lots of copulation, but I don't know that it is at will and that it is containable or intentional or all these different considerations that, of course, come into play in us humans as thinking beings, as able to make decisions on the execution of that desire, on the acting upon the mating ritual, the mating desire. Now, a bunch of years ago, when I was going to Columbia University and was working for a literary agent, one of whose clients was a scientist researching sexual desire in humans. So I got to read and type letters for who was going to publish this book. I had the opportunity to read about the findings of this researcher about the incredible spectrum, the variety of desires that humans have, sexual desire, right? And he just studied frequency. That was the main part of the book, and he came to the conclusion that there is a broad spectrum of desire and, or he calls it need, for sexual satisfaction or for orgasm, if you will, in human beings, so that it ranges from no desire at all to needing 2 orgasms a day so as not to go insane. So there's this broad spectrum of variations, and we don't recognize that enough in our cultures, right? And I'm going to talk about the cultures and what happened a little bit later. But this enormous spectrum just gave me pause as to, thinking about, what's the proper amount of sex in a good marriage, right? What's the proper amount of good sex in a functioning relationship? 2 times a week is ideal. That may be the average, but there are people who are perfectly happy with once a year or twice a month or you name it. And then are those who feel no desire, who feel no physical itch and triggeredness and excitement and that comes with thinking about or being in the vicinity of or looking into the eyes of the desired other being, human being, that triggers the desire in us. So that's the one spectrum that I'm looking at, this broad spectrum of biology. Why is that? Why is there such a broad spectrum? Well, it seems that part of it is biological, meaning that you're born with a certain amount of chromosomes and there can be variations, a certain amount of hormone production, a certain amount of libido, they call it, and it's really hard to define what that is and where that comes from, because it is kind of expected that once we go through puberty, we start to have all this libido, and we're supposed to then contain ourselves. When I grew up, it was still, until you're married. But of course, then came the 60s and 70s, and that went right out the window. A little more about that later. So there is such a thing as a physical sex drive, physical, mental, emotional mixed then, that has such a broad variety that it's very difficult to say, the ideal amount is X. It's just not true, because it's not true for so many people who have all these variations. Then, of course, we can start to look at who has the opportunity to live out their desire. In my last podcast, I talk about patriarchy and what that means for all of humanity, and especially for women and children and non-binary people. A little bit more about that later. So that in a patriarchal system, of course, men will create the opportunities to have as much sexual opportunity as meets their specific desire, right? Their specific amount of what they feel they need. So there is the creation of, from the harem to polygamy and many wives to the concubines and the prostitutes and the maids in the house that are supposed to service the men. In many cultures around the globe. So in a patriarchal society, men will always have the opportunity to satisfy their sexual desire, much more so than women. Although I found it particularly curious and almost funny that women of the really upper echelons in royalties and high society were allowed to have their bed boys or bedfellows. And I think it was in medieval times and before, those were often little people, men with dwarfism who would be there just to crawl under the blankets and pleasure the woman. So you have all these varieties of finding a way to satisfy the specific desire. And of course, that is particularly true when there's also religious prohibition of masturbation, which again is a topic that we now recognize is worldwide part of, again, human practice. We don't have much yet about in which other mammals that is actually the case. It doesn't, I haven't come across it. So correct me if I'm wrong, tell me about it. What is that we all find a way to masturbation in various ways? What happened to sexuality being a natural part of human existence? Being a natural part, like sleeping and eating and breathing and dancing and singing and celebrating life, right? Sexuality should be part of those very human features, very human expressions. And yet it needs to have form and it needs to be integrated so that it's harmonious with the entire life expression and life experience. And when we look further back beyond patriarchy and those empires and beyond the big monotheistic religions, the religions that have one God at the top and have male dominance, before those religions, we find, interestingly, that almost everywhere on the globe, cultures were inclusive of sexuality as being a normal part of life and to be celebrated between people, most of the time between couples, but they could be male and male, female and female, or of course the majority male and female. And it was fascinating for me to find out that, and I'll tell you the story. I was living in Queens, New York, in Long Island City, a particular part very close to Manhattan, as I was going to Columbia University. And my partner, then later husband at the time, Haitian, was always listening to French radio. This is in the 1980s, so it's a long time ago and before the internet. And on this French radio station, there were always interesting historical and literary and musical finds and interviews. So this particular day, and I'll never forget it because I thought this is so good, so important. There was a French writer and translator of old Sanskrits, and he had retranslated a lost chapter, or I think he had retranslated the entire Bhagavad Gita. You know, that one of those most ancient scriptures from 5,000 years ago or the like. And he had found, or archaeologists had found this chapter that was hidden sometime a few hundred years ago. And this entire chapter was about the middle people who are neither male nor female, or are bisexual, or what we call androgynous is the word, and who were the mediators, who were the judges, who were the peacemakers in the communities, because they would understand both sides if there were male-female conflicts, etc., or if there were other conflicts. So they were considered the mediators, and of course they had varying roles. Now, at the time when I heard this, I was just so gratified, because I had already known that in some ancient African cultures and communities, the same or something similar was the case. And a few years later, I read articles revealing that early writings of the pioneers coming into the Americas found indigenous people here in the US of A, on the territories of the Northern American continent, found cultures in which there were some men dressed as women and being couples either with another woman or another man. It varied, and they were highly alarmed and wrote back to the Pope and the Queen, as the representatives of God and the Bible, in which this was supposedly prohibited, writing about their alarm of how this will destroy, if this gets to the pioneers, if the pioneers will find out about this, this will destroy the culture and have such a bad influence upon the new American culture that it must be destroyed. And it is one of the reasons, so it was written in those papers, that children were taken away from Native Americans and put into these retraining schools, mostly Catholic or Anglican, to avoid such developments. So now we get to these cultural differences in the past, and how, for some reason, well, it's actually logical, in the monotheistic cultures, in the monotheistic religions, they were suddenly not allowed. And yet you have the persistence, of course, in the male world, because patriarchy and male dominance go along with monotheistic religions. You know, the one man at the top, I talk about that a lot. So the opportunity for men remained there, because later in the Islamic countries, you still had harems. In the Christian countries, you still had polygamy in many places. You still had the permission of concubines and so forth. And that, for males, continued, but for females, it became impossible almost, or a death sentence, to have any kind of multiple lovers, right? Even when I was in my 20s, in my mother's house, there were always students from Eastern countries who studied at the Waldorf Teaching Institute. And one of them was already a medical doctor learning anthroposophical medicine in addition to his doctorate, and was talking about that he and his colleagues made extra money in the country of Georgia, you know, at the time still USSR. But in the country of Georgia, they were making extra money repairing or reinserting a hymen into females so that they could be whole, in quotation marks, for their marriage night, for their virgin proof. So that whole behavior spills into modern times and is still practiced in some places today, that for females, exploring sexuality is still a very difficult area of their life, right? Often it is assumed, or my grandmother certainly assumed, that only men had sexual desire. I had some interesting conversations that would be too long to explore here, but with my grandmother, who was a gouvernante at the Duke's house or castle, teaching the children how to behave and how to speak and French and sitting upright with your hands by your sides, etc., and not moving. So, and her view of the world and sexuality certainly was that women did not have desire. Women were to lie still when the man had to execute his desire and have sex. So that teaches us how we still have a long way to go as females to even get to some kind of equality there as well, in terms of talking about our rights to having a natural sexual life. Yeah, it's interesting. Alex is saying that even after much research, okay, Melissa, too, that there is not enough about this topic out there in the world. But you can now research it. Just before this podcast, I went on Google and thought, well, let's see what's there on Google now. And I found that it is now publicly acknowledged that in Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization, and that's the Western point of view, same-sex relationships were so common, based on evidence from artwork as well as in literature, that they are depicted equally with those of the opposite sex. So, and there's various scholars that comment on this, on these old cultures. Like I had already said, the Bhagavad Gita had that chapter that was retranslated, and I therefore knew that this was the norm on all continents. Now, what happened? Why did that all stop or get demonized? And that is definitely to do with Buddhism and Christianity and Islam, those three biggest religions that all embrace male dominance, that all create patriarchy. And we don't think of it as being a feature in Buddhism, but the male monks in Buddhism that are picked when the boys are still very young children, you're going to be a monk and you're going to be a monk. And a third of the society in some places became monks, right? And later, there were also some females. But and these monks had, well, of course, we have this idealistic view that they were just doing good and helping people and servicing and praying and meditating, and I'm sure many, many were, but they also had power. Their word counted more than anybody else's. And that may not be as strong today, but it still is. And let me just say hi to Christine. Yeah, religion made them scared. Definitely. So these monotheistic religions come into the world, and suddenly there is prohibition of all kinds of natural sexual behaviors. So much so that in Judaism, you weren't even allowed to look at the other person's body, right? There was a little hole in the sheet that the woman had to put over herself for the penis to transcend into hopefully finding the vagina. So, I mean, these incredible control mechanisms, as I can only call them that. I don't know if you have another description for them. Become part of the entire control mechanism of society, so that you have male monks are not allowed to have sexuality at all. Female nuns are not allowed to have sexuality at all. So their desire is irrelevant, or has to be capped, or has to be actually maybe luckily turned into homosexual behavior with each other, which of course has been often the case, that because homosexuality could not exist in regular society, humans, both male and female or non-binary, would go into those professions. Of course, they were not considered profession, into those callings, because they could be safe there. And that seems like a very arbitrary thing to say. And of course, I can only back that up with individual stories that I know from friends of mine, like a dear friend of mine, politician, and professor of Namibian descent, was telling me how he grew up in a cloister with nuns, and how the nuns would spend time with each other, or bring the boys into their bedrooms, or bring the monks over. So, I mean, the back to the human desire, it is very, very hard to deny human desire for sexuality. And in my understanding and in my research, I found that what happens is that all kinds of perversions, and I really do think they're perversions, are created in order to somehow express this oppressed desire for normal sexuality. Of course, it always needs to be, and always was, reined in by the community, by the culture, by the crowd, by the tradition, so that it wasn't wild sexuality all over the place. But with sexuality, just as with many other things in life, like with fire, comes responsibility, right? So the children were always taught to be responsible for their body and to be responsible for the other person's body. And one could only have that interaction with the person that one would be responsible for. And of course, reproduction, and therefore children arising from those interactions, had to be responsibly planned and cared for. Um, yeah. So Melissa is telling us all the crazy aberrations. And yeah, and we have suppression, and this suppression leads to, let's look at that a little bit more in detail, to what is then called perversions. And what really is perversion? Perversion means that a natural behavior is turned into an unnatural behavior that is hurtful to others. That's really what perversion is. I mean, I could look it up. I didn't, but that's how I understand it. Tell me if you think it's otherwise. So what happens then? Then happens rape, then happens child rape, then happens all kinds of death cults combined with sexuality. It's really, really horrible. How do I know that? Because I studied that around a screenplay that I was working on, around a young girl. This is based on a true story, abducted into a child. At the time, I called it child prostitution ring, but these were really young kids between 12 and 15, abducted and sold for lots and lots of money as virgins. And of course, in today's world, we all talk about Epstein, but that was no new phenomenon. That's been going on ever since these oppressive behaviors existed and since we have patriarchy in our world. So I have looked into that, and the ugly depths of that, which happens when the natural behavior is not allowed to be in a naturally controlled environment. So with the patriarchal era, of course, also comes the ownership of people, of everybody. The king owns everybody, or the queen for that matter. It's the only female position of power when there happens to not be a male heir, right? That's the only way that happened in the patriarchal era. So, but the king owns everybody, and the father owns the family. So sexuality can happen on the behest of that male dominant person with everybody, whether it's with the women in the family or whether it's with the children, male and female in the family, because there is ownership of everybody. So we're slowly growing out of that, but there's still so much to learn and such a long way to go to come into an era where we have respect for each human being, and where we therefore allow each human being to be and become their own expression of their sexual identity and their sexual expression. And that again is a very slow process, coming out of all this ownership and perversion and prohibition, and thinking that it is normal to perform genital mutilation in every child. Think about it. Think about it, how incredibly disrespectful that is to the human child and to the human child's sexuality. Well, and again, to me, that is part of this male domination. And of course, we do it to our male children at the moment worse than to females, that we literally cut that which makes us humans, namely those sensitive parts that produce incredible joy and incredible pleasure. And that's what I wanted to talk about next. And my time is running away from me. That what makes us humans is that we have the ability to celebrate life in sexuality as well, that we have the ability to have sexual interactions just because of an exchange of love and pleasure and understanding and reciprocity. Reciprocity is really what is missing in this entire patriarchal era, right? Because you don't have reciprocity when you have male dominance in the marriage, and you don't have reciprocity even when you have the female dominant allowing the bed boys to the bed boys, not bad boys, to pleasure her. So reciprocity, mutuality, mutual pleasure, and coming to that celebration, just as we have music and dance and paintings and all kinds of art, sculpture, right? As we have all of that, we have the sexuality between two people that is mutually joyful, beneficial, respected. And then, of course, we have reproduction, which we can and actually have always been able to plan and rein in so that it is just falling into place when we want it. I mentioned that a little bit, I think, in the last podcast on patriarchy, that it is not a new invention that we have contraceptives. Absolutely not. The old Egyptians already had tampons made out of sheep's wool, and all older cultures that I have come across have herbal and other performances that will prohibit a pregnancy, that will prevent a pregnancy and or terminate an early pregnancy. So those are not new inventions. It is just that in the industrial age, we had lost those practices, actually, as of the witch burnings in Europe, which happened in the 11th, from 10th to 12th centuries, where over 1 million women were burnt at the stake. Now they're saying many millions. So anyway, it's an enormous amount of women who were herbalists were burnt at the stake because they no longer were permitted to be the midwives and the herbalists who could help women have some control over their reproductive organs. And then, of course, with the industrial age, we have this era where, the more children, the better, because when we have children, they will help us, they will work with us. And I don't think I came across somebody just a week ago or so who was saying, well, in the old days, women died in childbirth and 10 out of 12 children died before they could get a chance to grow up. That is only true for societies in which there was this unnatural relationship with sexuality and with medicine, and in which there was a toxicity in the culture that made it impossible for people to have a long life and or a healthy pregnancy. And that's particularly true for the Roman Empire, where lead was the main metal used for everything. And we know that today. And that is also true for the Japanese culture for a long time, where lead paste was used to create the white faces of the geishas, which I found fascinating as well. That was all lead. So the lead era, of course, produces a lot of toxicity. Now, in the late medieval times and the 1600s, when you had these large plagues, you had, again, other nutrition deficiencies and volcanic ash, etc. There's a lot going on always that causes these eras of a lot of child death, child mortality, and maternal mortality, and that does not occur in the more natural tropical and subtropical regions. Now, of course, in the northern parts of the world, you also have to deal with the extreme cold in the winter. And if you didn't have firewood or had to give your firewood to the king, you were condemned to freeze to death. So all these factors play into having natural reproduction and or controlled reproduction, if you will, that is harmonious for the community. All right, now, time is running away from us. My own experience, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a couple of little stories with coming to realize how much I was fascinated by this topic. Goes back to my childhood. I was one of three sisters, so the middle one of three sisters. And we never saw our father naked, nor our mother, and we had no idea. And though there were the general stories of the stork bringing the baby, my parents told us angels brought the baby. And in fact, when I was 9, my mother had another child, a boy who, however, did not survive, died at 2 weeks old. So I did not experience anything there either. And she was not well during her pregnancy. Then I did know that her big belly contained the baby, of course, but I did not really know much of how that all happened. So my older sister and I would sit together and try to figure out what the male body looked like with this thing called penis that we had somehow found or read or heard about, right? And it sounds so funny in today's world, where everybody can just go onto their phone and find out anything they want to find out. But yeah, so as 10-year-olds, we were imagining that this thing called penis gets stuck into the woman, and basically the man pisses into the woman and that makes babies. So the holy piss, I still find that really funny today. And then as a 14-year-old, I spent 3 months in Norway with my godmother, and she had a book sort of hidden behind other books. I don't remember how I found it, but I found it looking for something to read or look at. And it was about having sex without orgasm so that there wasn't a danger of pregnancy. And I thought, oh my God, that must be so frustrating. And I don't know whether I had already discovered masturbation. I'm not quite sure. Possibly. So, and it was describing how this is the elevated humanity that has this slow sex without orgasm ever. And I'm like, oh my God, is that really how it works? And then there were other experiences with people who just had a baby. And I thought, no, it can't be. And they were so in love and they were so like, oh, it just felt like there was something really beautiful going on in there. I wrote in my diary at the time, this was the pre notion or I can't find the right translation for that word. Of course, that was at the time I wrote in German, of erotics. The word, I didn't really know what it meant either, but that I do remember writing that in my diary. And later, when I looked at that diary, crossing it out because I thought, oh my God, if somebody sees that I'm writing these words, that's terrible. Yeah, and then times changed so quickly in the 60s that at age 16, I remember we were on some class trip with my class from school, and I thought, oh my God, I'm the only one who's still a virgin, because they were all talking about their boyfriends and this and that and the other. And I thought, I need to get rid of this virginity. This is not good. And that's when I learned, when exploring myself and figuring out what to do, I learned that apparently there are different kinds of hymen in girls. And then later I learned that there are different kinds of foreskins in boys. So that even there is a broad spectrum of variety and biological appearance, right? So that we have, and I don't have time anymore to go into that, but there too, biology shows us that it's never straightforward. It must be this way, and this determines what you are and how you are and whether you can and or cannot and so forth have copulation or sexual experiences with such and such. And then, of course, it didn't take long until I learned that what really makes human sexuality so special is that we have all these sensual experiences, that we have this gentle touch, that we have kisses, that we have all these variations that make the interaction between two humans so exciting and so wonderful, and can have a broad spectrum, again, from playful giggliness to this deep, tearful experience of very deep, deep connection. And since I've been fascinated with this topic for the last 60 years, since I was 10 and now I'm 70, and I'm way not done, I think we need to recognize how incredibly wonderful that gift is that we have as humans, to enjoy sexuality in all its depth and tenderness and sweetness and reciprocity, mutuality, enjoying that the other person is enjoying what we are, how we are interacting with them. So that's really the bottom line of the broad spectrum of sexuality, that we as humans can make it beautiful. We don't have to go to the perversion. We don't have to go to the dominatrix. We can have it mutually playful. Of course, some of that may be playful, but we don't have to go to the vicious, violent, and dominant versions of sexuality that are still so prevalent in our cultures, because we still have a warring culture. And that's why often sexuality is perceived as a war between the sexes or between the partners, and somebody wins, whereas it could be exchange and incredibly beautiful. So that's what I want to put out there. And those are my last words. And thank you, Christine and Melissa and Alex, for joining me. I am so honored to have you here. Yeah. And the fact that we have so many problems is maybe just the era that we need to transcend, that we need to go through to get to the beauty. That's what I mean. All right, everybody. So learn more about the beautiful sides of sexuality and learn about mutual satisfaction and joyfulness. Mwah. Talk to you next time. I think next time it's going to be anxiety and depression. It's not as much fun. So, but all these topics that the world is tackling. And of course, I will revisit this topic, I'm sure, hopefully with guests in the future. But it's so fascinating. Ciao, everybody. Love you lots. Love each other. Enjoy.